Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury.
And one U.S. territory just over 2,000 miles away from North Korea in the crosshairs. Overnight, the small Pacific island of Guam, home to crucial American military bases and more than 7,000 U.S. forces on alert after North Korea said in a statement its leaders are seriously considering a plan to target the territory with missiles.
While the media spotlight is now shining on Guam, it ignores the some 160,000 civilians who live there, the history of U.S. rule, and just how the United States acquired a territory thousands of miles from its mainland. To discuss this, we spoke to Professor David Vine of American University.
My name is David Vine. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C., and I'm the author of Base Nation: How U.S. Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World. And the United States has turned much of Guam into one large military base. There are actually multiple military bases on Guam, but at least around 25% of the island currently is occupied by the U.S. military. So large swaths of the island look like just one massive base. There's a very large Air Force and Navy presence in particular. And the United States has occupied and controlled Guam since the Spanish-American War of 1898, when the United States defeated Spain, the remnants of the Spanish Empire, and seized some of its remaining colonies, namely Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico. At the same time, it occupied Cuba and continued to exercise tremendous control and influence in Cuba until the Cuban Revolution. But very quickly after 1898, the U.S. Navy in particular occupied and turned Guam into a base and ran Guam under military administration for years. Guam had been colonized previously by the Spanish, so it's been a colonized place for centuries now. Guam is also unusual in that during World War II, it was the only part of the United States, the only large occupied part of the United States that was occupied by Japanese forces. Philippines would be another example. But Japan occupied Guam for much of World War II before the U.S. military liberated it. In the process, however, the island and the island people, especially the local Chamorro people, indigenous people, suffered grievously, both under Japanese occupation, and many thousands were confined to concentration camps of a kind, where they suffered. And after the war, actually beginning during the war, once the United States had reoccupied the island, the military began a very large base building project that proceeded to occupy acres and acres and acres of local land, displacing people in the process. And after the war, most of that displacement remained in place. People were not allowed to return to their lands, to their homes, and instead were displaced elsewhere on the island as the United States maintained Guam in a highly militarized, base-infused state. And Guam has remained a part of the United States, but a part of the United States that is in a colonial relationship with the United States. People in Guam do not have the right to vote for president. They do not have congressional representation that of any note. There are non-voting representatives, but like the other remaining colonies, the U.S. government and many of us like to talk about these places as territories, but fundamentally they remain in a colonial relationship with the United States. So along with Puerto Rico, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Washington, D.C., though it has a little bit more democratic power, Guam has remained colonized largely because of the significance of the island to the U.S. military, because it provides a launch pad, as it was during World War II, a launch pad from which the United States could deploy military forces into East Asia. An important base that provides a threat from the United States to both China, North Korea, and Russia. Of course, it's important to point out, however, that Guam is part of a constellation of U.S. bases in East Asia that surround China and Russia and the much smaller North Korea. So scores of bases in Japan, South Korea, now again in the Philippines, and around the Asia-Pacific region, numbering in total into the hundreds of U.S. bases, far from U.S. borders, and surrounding China, Russia, North Korea.
So I found a U.S. military propaganda video from World War II, and it has a native of Guam talking about how great life was before the Japanese took over from the U.S. military, and as you said, occupied Guam for 3 years.
Soon we will find out what those Japs have done to our island. Beautiful it was then, and living there made us happy. There were 21,000 of us, and we knew each other as friends. Although we were far out in the Pacific, we were proud to be under the American flag. We were content. It was a good life.
But what's not talked about is, even to this day, is the history of the natives of Guam struggling for democracy and for independence under U.S. rule. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, and if anything good comes out of this really scary and frightening moment for the people of Guam, most importantly, but for people around the world, U.S. citizens, people in Korea and elsewhere. If anything good comes of this, it might be to call attention to the undemocratic situation in which the people of Guam are currently living. Many of them have been struggling for full democratic rights in the United States for decades. The right to vote for president, the right to have elected representatives in Congress, in both the House and the Senate. And this struggle has been ongoing since prior to World War II. I'm not surprised that, of course, that there's a propaganda video showing a local person in Guam talking about the way of life before the war under U.S. occupation. But the fact of things is that Guam was in a colonial situation that, for the large part, did not enrich the island and its people, and instead people were living prior to the war and since the war in some of the poorest conditions of anyone in the United States, and all its occupied territories.
And to be clear, the reason why the residents of Guam and other U.S. territories were not given the right to vote as states had been given as the U.S. expanded into the 50 states in the 19th century is because they were thought of as racially inferior, and the U.S. was sort of civilizing them, but they weren't ready for democracy yet.
But very much it is ideas about race and racist ideas about the people of Guam and the other colonies, Puerto Rico and American Samoa among them. These racist ideas have very much been part of the reason that the U.S. government has prevented the people of Guam and the other colonies from gaining full democratic rights like other U.S. citizens enjoy.
You had talked about your book a little earlier, but it's an assumption in the media and in history books and common discourse that the numerous bases the United States has are for a benevolent reason. They're to protect democracy. They're to foster peace. They're to support democratic governments. What has your research found?
In short, the answer to your question is no. The conventional wisdom about U.S. bases abroad for decades has been that U.S. bases spread democracy, ensure peace and stability, and deter enemies. But for the most part, these claims have not been backed up with any evidence. The first point, the claim that U.S. bases abroad spread democracy is fairly comical, or sadly comical, because what my research has shown is that the United States has bases in fully 33 or more undemocratic countries ruled by often dictators or undemocratic regimes, where U.S. bases are directly supporting regimes that are preventing democratic rule in their countries. So U.S. bases are blocking the spread of democracy in many cases. Elsewhere, it's clear that U.S. bases are causing a range of other harms to local people, causing environmental damage, displacing people, as the case of Guam very poignantly demonstrates with the people who were displaced during and after World War II. Elsewhere, you see crimes being sadly committed by U.S. military personnel against locals, most prominently in Okinawa. You see prostitution industries, exploitative sex work industries popping up around bases in Korea, South Korea, among others, and a whole range of well-demonstrated forms of damage that U.S. bases have inflicted. And meanwhile, there is little to no evidence that U.S. bases overseas protect the United States. That, again, has been an assertion, but one rarely backed up by any evidence. And instead, you see U.S. bases overseas frequently contributing to military tensions. I think it's worth thinking about how people in the United States would feel if China or Russia were to build a single base anywhere near U.S. borders, for example, in the Caribbean or in Mexico. Meanwhile, the United States has literally hundreds of bases surrounding both China and Russia. And you can imagine how they respond. They don't see these bases as bringing stability. Instead, they rightfully see bases like Guam as a threat, and they are intended to be a threat. Guam is known as the tip of the spear in the military, and U.S. bases abroad are meant to threaten. And this does not create a more stable international environment. Instead, it frequently encourages countries like China, like Russia, and like North Korea to further militarize, to boost their military spending. And the danger is that this can and certainly has led to spiraling tensions, spiraling military spending, and then spiraling tensions, as we're seeing today, very, very dangerously for the world.